Hi, Maggie. Welcome to Author Talk. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I guess the first thing is, how are you doing in these unusual circumstances these days?
I think soldiering on is probably the best thing. I mean, I'm fine. Obviously, it's frustrating. I miss all the things I normally do, but I'm trying to find things to occupy my time.
So do you get out of the house much then?
Yes, a fair bit. Try to go for a walk every day and just round and about locally. Haven't been very far.
Yeah, we're not locked down anything like we used to be, I guess. So that's a good thing
No,
anyway.
no, thank goodness.
Yeah. How's it affected your writing? Have you had more time to write or?
Theoretically, yes, but having the family at home with me has caused its own problems in terms of concentration. I can always concentrate better if I have the house to myself, and that's now a rare treat.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's strange because my wife will often say, "Oh well, we're not bothering you. We're quiet," and like it's just something about having other people in the house and sort of my domain, as it were. It
Even
just
if they're not actually coming in, there's always the feeling that they might.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, but then for us, we've also had construction going on the last 2 months.
Oh,
We're doing some rooms, so that's just taken everything apart.
yes.
Gave me a chance to rearrange my office though, so that was good.
Well, I started off very well the first week, sorting out files and everything, and gradually more and more thought because time goes on. I think because I have unlimited time, things are taking longer than when I have to fit them into a narrow time slot between other things.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I mean, at the beginning also, I was very gung ho, getting things organized, sort of trying to push into the new frontier, try to develop some online forums and stuff, and I just nothing really went anywhere. So this is basically the author talk is what's come of that, of all the various things I was trying,
Yes.
and yeah, it's just sort of easing into this sort of, well, they did say it was going to be a new normal, so it does kind of start to feel like it, doesn't it?
Yes, I guess so. It's easier one-to-one than trying to do a conference with half a dozen people, I find.
Yeah, yeah, that's for sure. Especially if it's a Zoom conference that's not a webinar, then you just have voices and people all over the place.
Mm.
And I think I had one with 3 people, and that was challenging enough with everyone wanting to speak. You just imagine
Yes.
half a dozen to a dozen. Have you been on many then?
Oh, no, not at all. I think maybe two different things, and in each case, I really didn't enjoy them.
Yeah.
This is better. This is much more relaxed, partly because it's just the two of us, and partly because I know you, of course.
Yeah, well, this is a forum that I think really that is designed at the moment anyway for one-to-one rather than groups. That's changing. My daughter's on the House Party app, which they get together at like 8 people and they play games and everything and they're video chatting, but they're young, so they're used to the chaos. So what I thought we'd do today is, well, we'll go through your books because you've been publishing now for about 7 years. Is that right?
Yes, I should think so.
And I noticed that your books sort of, in a way, well, not all of them, but in a way, they tell the story of your life in some way. Not your whole life, but but aspects of your life. Um, and that's partly your writing life and partly your personal life. And so I thought we'd maybe start from the beginning and sort of take a book at a time, and you can just sort of discuss that. So for example, we'll get the nonfiction one out of the way, I suppose, at the beginning, because that was one of the earliest ones you published was Easy Money for Writers and Wannabes.
By a strange coincidence, I have it here.
Ah, excellent. Yeah, so Easy Money for Writers and Wannabes. And you wrote this book in relation to your own writing for magazines, basically. Is that right?
I did. For years and years, I'd been sending in little snippets, all sorts of things, jokes, anecdotes, tips, photographs occasionally. And the book came about because when I was at the Writers' Summer School in Swanwick, I happened to mention this to somebody on the committee, and they said, oh, that would make an interesting workshop for our members. So the following year, I ran a workshop, And some of the people who attend it said, that's really interesting. You should put all these ideas into a book, hence the book. And up to press, it's been my bestseller, my only non-fiction book and my bestseller.
Excellent. So it's full of helpful tips for people to make money through writing for magazines and whatnot. Is that correct?
It is. I always say that people can't fail to make money if they follow the tips, because it's not just knowing what to write. We all have inspirations, but it's knowing where to target it too, because different magazines, different newspapers all have their own requirements. And so it's important to research the market first and know the kind of thing that will go down well in a particular magazine, say, and then send your item to that editor. Otherwise, you're just wasting everybody's time. I mean, you wouldn't send a risque anecdote to the lady. And equally, you wouldn't send tips on how to keep your top hat in pristine condition to one of the gaudier publications.
Right. I was wondering then, that's obvious. I mean, with the magazines, I think it's very obvious because each magazine has a very strong niche. Do you apply sort of this as a marketing guideline to any of your fiction books? Because obviously they do say you should, to some degree, write to a particular audience or a particular genre so that you can market your book as well. Do you worry about that, or do you sort of write what you feel to write?
Well, it depends on the book. The first fiction I actually published, they were collections of short stories, and quite a lot of them had already been published in various magazines or they'd won competitions. And so I decided to group them into themes. The first one, and the most successful I can imagine so far anyway, was the one that was essentially murder stories of various sorts. It was called Anyone for Murder. The second one was to do with people moving from one country to another, sometimes because they wanted to, sometimes because they were forced to, and what happened to them. And the third collection was really tales with a twist. And I'd had success with all of those in different fields. So I brought all those out to begin with as ebooks, separate ebooks. And then when someone said, well, why can't I get hold of a paperback? I realized that the ebook collections were rather too thin on their own to make a decent paperback. So I put them all together, and the result was this. Can you see that clearly?
Yeah, that looks good. Yeah.
So obviously the picture is just a third of each of the individual covers. But Anyone for Murder has definitely been the most popular. Murder does sell.
Yes.
Even in some cases, it's quite humorous. I don't really go for gruesome in most of my stories, but that certainly has sold very well.
So with your fiction, did you start writing short stories then? Because you do have a few novels, but would you say you started with a short fiction first?
Oh yes, yes. I've written short stories for magazines for years.
All right.
Some of them might be as short as 850, 1,000 words. Others might have been 2,000 to 3,000 words, or even slightly longer. But that's a genre in its own right, of course.
Right.
Writing a full book is a very different thing, which is why up to press I haven't done a great deal of it. But once I got the bit between my teeth and started on a saga, that just went on and on and on until it got to 130,000 words plus.
Was that your Shadow of the Past, or is another one?
Which curiously enough I have here.
I also have there. Excellent.
You can see the thickness.
Yes, that's a good sized book. That was your first novel, wasn't it?
Yes. And all in all, including the research, it took me about 12 years to write.
So were you writing that while you were doing all the short stories then, presumably, as well?
Oh yes. Yeah. I've always had several projects on the go at the same time.
Right.
I've never found it possible to relax into one genre. I've always done a bit of this, a bit of that, a short story, an anecdote, even a poem occasionally,
yeah.
A review, a short play. I've done all those things.
Too many interesting other options than just being stuck in one genre, isn't it?
That's the problem. I'm something of a literary butterfly. I, I envy people who can just focus on one thing, but I've never been able to do it.
Yeah, I know what you mean. So the shadows of the past, that actually comes a bit from your past, doesn't it?
Yes, it started off really as a memoir. When I was 17, I went to France with a group of my school friends. We were all doing A-level French, and we were all very conscious of the fact that our spoken French was poor, because back then, most of the work we did at school was reading, writing, translating, very little speaking. So we went off to a youth work camp, which we thought was going to be wonderful, an international work camp. It turned out to be a complete shambles in the middle of nowhere outside a very odd village. And we discovered over the course of the weeks that we were there that all sorts of things were going on behind the scenes, most of which we understood very imperfectly because our French was so bad. And we couldn't understand so much of it, the things that were happening, that really it was years later when I returned to the idea and thought, what on earth was going on in that place? And by that time, my French was much better. And I went back and started digging and found out that quite a lot of the suspicions we'd had at the time were true. For example, a girl who fell foul of the chap in charge and disappeared. We never knew what happened to her. All sorts of strange comings and goings in the middle of the night. The man in charge, one day very keen that everybody should work until they dropped, and the following day just wanted us all off the premises, and we never knew why. All sorts of things like that. And it was all brought together when I found out what really had been going on. And then I started wondering why it was that the people in the nearby village and so on didn't do anything about it, because they knew that these weird things were happening, and yet nothing was ever said. And anyway, to cut a very long story short, the middle part of the book, the 1960s part, is pretty much what actually happened with a bit of embroidery. The rest of it is finding out why. And there's a long section going back to when that particular village was occupied by the Germans during the Second World War, and the repercussions that were still felt in the 1960s and continued to be felt much later, even into the 1980s. So I spent a lot of time there. I did a lot of research. I talked to a lot of people, and it all came together. And my 12-year, what could I describe it as? Perhaps not my chef d'oeuvre, that sounds very pompous, but certainly a book of which I'm inordinately fond. And if you look again at the front cover, you can see a photograph of the young couple in a frame. Well, the girl is actually me with my boyfriend from the village at the time, who was then enormously helpful afterwards with my research. I went back, I found him and his family again, I interviewed them, and they were very, very helpful in filling in a lot of gaps for me. So it all came together very nicely.
Yeah, it sounds awesome. That's an experience that modern parents would be very frightened for their children to have. It sounds like.
Well, if we'd had access to a telephone, to emails and so on, then I don't think any of us would have stayed. But we paid our fares, everything was booked. Our parents weren't expecting to hear from us for all those weeks, except maybe a postcard. And to leave prematurely would have been very difficult and expensive. There was a sort of village where there was a bus twice a day. As,
Right.
as I said, our plane tickets were booked, and we couldn't just up and leave and rebook because we didn't have the money. And that we had obviously no mobile phones in those days, even access to a phone in the place. Everything was very closely guarded by the chap in charge.
Yeah, it was
So
such a
I'm
different
sure
world then, no? Yeah.
if our parents had had any notion of what was going on, I'm sure that at least one of them would have come across and collected us, sleeping down tunnels in iron beds and all sorts of weird characters wandering around the forest with guns and things that went bump in the night. It would not have liked it.
This it really does sound like a story that should be made into a movie. It almost sounds like it's already set for a movie.
It would make a brilliant film, or a TV series.
So when was that set then? Was it in this, not the
Well,
70s, I wanted to say, but
the heart of it was the summer of 1965, which was when I was doing my A-levels. I know it seems like ancient history now. So that was an entire chunk, and then it went back to just before the start of the Second World War, when the invasion was threatened, and then when the Germans actually marched into the village and changed everything. And then to pull it all together, I needed a section 20 years later where somebody would go along and find what had happened. So it wasn't just one girl who went missing, which happened in reality, but in my book, 3 girls went missing.
wow.
And it was the person in the 1980s who happened to stumble across the village by accident, who then uncovered what had happened to them. It started off when she was in the forest and came across some remains, which were interesting to say the least, and couldn't understand why the village policeman, who said she'd be better off minding her own business and just moving on. And she wasn't the sort of person who would just move on. She became intrigued, and gradually the whole thing unraveled. It is a very long story.
Yeah, but it sounds very involved and very interesting. Yeah. So that was the first novel that you wrote, sort of based around something in your life.
Yes.
You've written now also Workhouse Orphans was a more recent one, wasn't it? And that was based on
Yes.
some ancestors of yours, was it?
If you can see the cover there, that's the Workhouse Orphan. And inside, I don't know how clearly you can see this, but the young man in the photograph, can you see that? Well, that's taken from a regimental photograph. And the young man on the right-hand side behind the Lewis gun is the young man who inspired the story, because he was a workhouse orphan. He was born in London, was sent up to the West Riding of Yorkshire when he was very, very young, about 12, I think, around about 1900, and had to work down a Yorkshire pit, hence the back cover of the book. And he married one of my great aunts, which is how he came into my family history. But sadly, he was called up for the First World War and was killed just before his 22nd birthday. So it was a very short life, and in the main a very unhappy one. But I became intrigued by the little I knew of his childhood and wanted to know what it would have been like for a child like that, who was sent up in similar circumstances as thousands were. So I did a lot of research, as much as I could find about him, but also in general. So a lot of research into workhouses and so on. And I even went down a couple of coal mines in the course of my research to try and imagine what it would have been like. So the story starts off in the East End of London, but most of it's set in the West Riding of Yorkshire, in a fictional village, but it's set just outside Halifax, that sort of area surrounded by mines. But it's not all doom and gloom. I've gone into how awful it must have been for him in the beginning, but there are some optimistic notes as well and some happy scenes. And I've only taken the story up to when he was about 14, so the shadow of the First World War hasn't yet fallen on things.
Right. And you so this is an interesting book. It's written for what age group would you say you targeted?
Well, that's a good question, Edwin. I started off thinking of it as general purpose, and then realised, because I was keeping the chapters quite short, it would be suitable for younger readers. But people who've bought it have been all ages. I've had some people who've been very interested in sociology who've loved it. I think my oldest reader was a lady of 85 who came up to me during one of the talks and said that her father, I think it was her father, not her grandfather, had been a barber and had actually gone along to the workhouse and cut the people's hair. And then after that, somebody else came up to me and said, well, I've bought it as a bedtime read for my children. One is 7, one is 9. I'm reading it to them chapter by chapter. They love it, but I'm doing it mainly just to show them how lucky they are compared to the children in the past. So
Yeah.
really suitable for all ages.
Yeah, that's really interesting how you get the two sides of it, because you do want to definitely, it's hard to convince kids, isn't it, that things in the past weren't always as they are now, as wonderful as they are now.
Because
Um,
children might read it, I haven't made it too graphic.
right.
Um, I've made it clear that there were fairly brutal times with beatings involved, but I haven't gone into things like sexual abuse, which must also have happened at the same time. I thought that wasn't the right sort of theme to have if children were going to get hold of it.
Right. You have some interesting um, tales about how children have received it and some of the questions they've had as well when you presented it, I think.
Yes, indeed. I ran a group in Ripon Library for some children who were just really top primary age. So we're talking about 10, 11. And when I was reading extracts saying things like, oh, David, my main character, hated having to get out of bed at 5 in the morning to go for yet another hard day's work. And one child said, well, I just have told them I didn't feel like going. And I pointed out that, you know, back in those days, you couldn't just tell your employee you didn't feel like going. He would rapidly convince you otherwise.
Exactly.
And when we were talking about the food in the workhouse particularly, how plain and repetitive it is, one little girl asked me if there was a vegetarian option. You know, that kind of thing, they just couldn't grasp it. Or a large part of the book is the fact that David was separated from his brothers and sister, who were still in the workhouse in London, didn't know if we'd ever see them or hear from them again. And one child said, well, why didn't he just borrow somebody's mobile and give them a phone call? You know, that kind of thing they just couldn't grasp because it was so different.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even when I grew up in the 70s, it was different enough, let alone the turn of the last century. It's hard to imagine, isn't it?
And language was another feature, because I was trying to explain that when he was in the East End of London, he'd have spoken with a local accent. When he was suddenly catapulted up to West Yorkshire into a mining community with a completely different accent and dialect, he couldn't understand a word they said at first, and they couldn't understand him. And then again, the children said, well, why not? They were all speaking English, weren't they? But of course, with no radio, no television, people 200 miles from each other had no idea how the other people spoke, and in many cases, it's completely incomprehensible. I know this to be true because my father was also born in the East End of London, and when he was 7, his family moved to Durham, and he was sent to school, coincidentally with a lot of children whose parents were minors, and there again had terrible trouble trying to fit in and understand till he picked up the local dialect. He had to fight every boy in the school before he was accepted. And some of this comes over in the book as well, when David is confronted with the other boys in the mine, who didn't take to him straight away by any means.
Yeah, there's so many things that have changed, isn't there? But
Mm.
I mean, I for one still find many of the dialects incomprehensible. So, but, um, so this one was targeted a little bit at kids, although it's a all ages book. But you have another YA book, is it? Young adults,
Well,
Wheels of Fire.
this is a very short story, really. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
A lot of the background is taken from the days when I used to take children on trips abroad. I was a teacher for many years, and I've organised many exchanges with both France and Germany and school trips. So I have a fund of memories of those days. But the main protagonist, the girl in the wheelchair, just came to me out of nowhere, because I'd never taken a child abroad who was in a wheelchair. And I suddenly started thinking, how would it be? What problems would that throw up? And then the girl in the wheelchair herself turned out to be a very feisty character with her own reasons for wanting to go on this particular trip. She'd been involved in a road accident which had killed her mother, and she was out for revenge. because the person who crashed into their car was a French lorry driver, but he was never prosecuted. And she felt that nobody cared about what happened to her, what happened to her mother. And she decided that she was going to go to France at the earliest possible opportunity, track this guy down and make him pay for what he'd done. Or if she couldn't track him down personally, at least she was going to cause no end of a kerfuffle and make his nation pay. So she set off to Paris with ideas of what she was going to do, which of course turned out completely differently.
Right.
What she was planning to do was quite outrageous, but what she actually did turned out to be an act of heroism.
Okay. So it sounds like from the description, like it could be quite a fun story. Is that sort of the feel you have, or is it very serious?
There's a lot of humour in it, and a lot of the characters in the story are actually drawn from pupils I've had in the past, or indeed colleagues I've had in the past, some of whom might recognise themselves, although obviously I've changed the names. But anybody reading between the lines who'd been on one of those trips would be able to pick out quite a few and say, oh yes, I remember that, or I remember so-and-so. Because a lot of the incidents are things that actually happened, even though, of course, I've embroidered them shamelessly.
So it's another book that's based on your own experiences as well. So that's interesting. So you find your own life. I mean, it does sound like a very interesting life, and so it's been a rich source of inspiration for your books. Then.
Yes, indeed. I find so. I've worked abroad quite a lot and travelled abroad, and that tends to come into a lot of the stories. The teaching background, obviously, and just life in general, really. Life at school, life at university, during my travels, working here, there and everywhere. One book I plan to write, which I haven't written yet, is the first time I went to the United States, when I was a camp counsellor in an hotel, a summer resort, not unlike the one in Dirty Dancing, if you've seen the film.
Yeah, okay.
There's a wealth of material there to be exploited.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And then travelling around the States in a Greyhound bus. I'll get down to that one day.
Yeah, it sounds interesting too. There's one part that we haven't discussed yet that's sort of more current, and that's your experiences with in television, basically.
Oh yes, all that's ground to a halt at the moment, I'm afraid.
I was wondering about that. Yeah.
Yes, it's starting to creep back gradually, but a lot of the film crews just shut down altogether, and now they're working under very changed circumstances. But yes, I did that for years. I should think I started about 2002, and all the programs I've worked on have been made in Yorkshire, but it's been a fair variety. Heartbeat, The Royal, Touch of Frost, Emmerdale, of course, which has been my main interest for a number of years. But also I've worked on a few rather unremarkable films, and one that even the actors in it hope is going to be consigned to oblivion. I'd better not mention the name.
Oh, I was wondering if you're going to share it with us or not.
Well, what I can share with you is that it was made by a foreign film crew. It was billed as an erotic drama, although I can assure you that the scenes I was in were neither dramatic nor erotic.
Okay.
There were some pretty well-known British actors in it, all of whom said they were going to die of shame if any of their friends ever saw it. It went video.
So they must have had a good casting agent to convince them to join the show then before they read the script or something.
Well, I think they must have done. Yes, it was pretty extreme, but nonetheless, it was fun to do just because it was such a shambles. Because normally things run pretty smoothly, but this particular one was ludicrous.
Oh,
I could almost write a whole book about what went on there.
Probably should. Have you thought to? Yeah, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I've always kept a diary, and I am thinking about writing something about my experiences as an extra. There's certainly plenty of material, but of course I'll have to tread very carefully. I don't want to find myself being sued.
Right.
Put a positive spin on things and careful not to tread on anyone's toes.
Do you think you'd write it as a nonfiction or base a novel around the set or something?
No, it would have to be non-fiction as a memoir. I've already written a lot of stories based on being in television and filming, but they've all been fiction. Just maybe an idea has been sparked off by something that's happened on set, but it's not a true account of what's happened. It's just a starting point. And I've written one or two short articles about it as well for magazines, and one person interviewed me on the subject quite extensively a few years ago. There's plenty to say. And
Right.
even
Yeah.
some of my old things keep cropping up. And Heartbeat is on in the afternoons. And every now and then somebody will ring me up and say, I'm sure I saw you on television yesterday afternoon, Maggie. Yeah, that would be me.
So you hope to get back to that soon, well, when possible, I imagine.
I'm not really sure. I think I might have been there, done that, got the T-shirt. I enjoy the work, but having to get up in the dark on winter mornings and report to the studios in Leeds or some other location at 7 o'clock and be driving home in the dark and sometimes not getting back till 9, 10 o'clock. Because I've had this long break, I'm not sure how much it appeals to me at the moment. So the jury's out on that one. I may or may not go back to it. I'll see.
Yeah.
When I'm contacted, I'll see how I feel about it.
It's interesting, isn't it? How we were moving along in a routine that just felt normal, and then all
Mm,
of a sudden it's all changed. And I'm the same. Like some of the stuff I really just don't like. Before the lockdowns and whatnot, it was fairly rigorous, and I was like, okay, I have to go to this. I have to go to this. I wanted to as well, but now that it's all stopped, I don't really want certain parts of it to start up again.
well, it's been 6 months, hasn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
I really miss meeting, well, my writers' groups, of course, Ripon Writers and York Writers. I miss other events. I miss meeting individual friends to talk about writing. One or two have been round and we've sat socially distanced in the garden, but it's not the same as having a group. Ripon Writers group, we're keeping going with emails. We try to keep up with the themes we already had planned and exchange emails. That's going quite well, but it's not the same as face to face, of course.
Right. Is there, I mean, can you imagine any technology or experience other than face to face that might work for you, or is it really like the absence of that one-on contact kind of thing?
Well, I think we might have to settle for it
Hmm.
because when lockdown first happened, somebody was saying, oh, give it 3 months and we're back to normal. Now it looks as if we're not going to be normal anytime in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I do agree with
So if
that.
things are not going to fold altogether, some of us who've been reluctant to use things like Zoom, and I must admit I count myself amongst them, may just have to bite on the bullet and accept that's the way things will have to be done, rather than
Yeah,
let it together.
yeah, it does look like it's going to go for a while, especially with all the various colds and flu seasons coming up to join on. Yeah. So, do you have? We're getting near the end of our time, but I was just wondering, do you have a project you're working on now that you'd like to share?
Well, as I said, the memoir about what it was like to be a television extra, I'm working on that. I'm still writing short stories. I've just had another one accepted. And I have an idea at the back of my mind for developing one of my other stories into a radio play. It started off life as a short story about a man in prison. It's called Bill's Last Night. It's already been published as a short story. I turned it into a 5-minute play last year at the Writers' Summer School in Swanwick, and it was produced there. In fact, I actually won an award for it, coincidentally. That award.
Almost like you planned all of this. All your things are in easy reach.
Basically, everybody curates their background, don't they?
Yes, that's true.
Um, so this was the Swanwick version of the Oscar. It's called a Swanee.
Okay, nice.
I won that. So heartened by that, I thought I might just try and expand it into a radio play. So I haven't done very much with it yet, but that's something that I intend to do. We'll just have to see how that goes.
Right.
I keep toying with the idea of writing sequels to some of the books I've already written. I did, in fact, write a prequel to Shadows of the Past. I don't know if you're aware of that.
I did see that, yeah. I like the title, foreshadowing it.
It's very very short, but it gives a lot of background into why the girls who went to France that fateful summer decided to go. So it has quite a lot about what French teaching was like in English grammar schools in those days, and why the girls who went over could have conjugated any verb of your choice or translated a paragraph from Moliere, but weren't very sure how to order a cup of coffee.
Right.
That kind of thing. So anybody who's interested in language teaching and how things used to be back then might find that interesting, because French and German in those days were taught very much like Latin. It was expected that you could read it, write it, translate it, but not necessarily speak it.
Do you think it's changed a lot since then? My daughter's taking French right now, and I'm not seeing a lot of conversational French.
Well, I can only speak of my own experience, but my last teaching job when I was at Ripon Grammar School for several years, it was very, very different. We had every audio-visual aid you can imagine. All the lessons were conducted in the language and so on, which is far from being the case when I was at school. And of course, the children were encouraged to go on exchange visits and that kind of thing, which either we weren't, or perhaps in those days, most of us couldn't afford it anyway.
Yes, that's true.
So yes, the opportunities for speaking to French children. And of course, ever since I left, they now do conference calls with the French partner school. They all have pen friends and speak to them on Zoom and video calls and all the rest of it. So it's very, very much better than it used to be. Certainly, from the point of view of spoken French, whether the written French has kept up with it, or whether grammar has been consigned to a dark corner, I don't really know.
Yeah, I do suspect from your description then that the teaching in different schools is it's very school specific, I think.
I'm sure that's true.
I don't think my daughter's school has really embraced the technology very much yet.
It will. It's coming.
Yeah, it has to eventually.
When I was at school, the only authentic French we heard was once a week for 50 minutes. There was a radio program called BBC French, when there was some attempt to give us a little authenticity, but otherwise it was all very English teachers speaking to us in French sometimes, but mostly in English. For example, the literature we studied for A-level, we read the text in French, but all the discussions were in English, all the essays were written in English. And by the time I got to Manchester University and found that everybody was in the same boat, we were horrified when one of the lecturers started to lecture in French because we couldn't follow it.
So I think we are about out of time for today. So thank you for joining me. And I wanted to just ask you where people can find you online, Facebook or your website.
All of those. I have my own website, which is just maggiecobbett.co.uk. I'm on Facebook. I have an Amazon page. And I'm fortunate in that my surname, Cobbett, isn't very common. So as long as people spell it correctly, Cobbett, if they put Maggie Cobbett into a search engine, they will find me.
Right.
People who miss it, or perhaps add an R instead of one of the B's, thus making it into Corbett, will not find me.
They won't, yeah.
So 2 B's, 2 T's. I'm very easy to track down.
Right, and you have an interview on our Author Insights segment of our website as well, I believe. So thanks very much then for joining me today.
The time's gone quickly. I've enjoyed it.
Yes, it has. We'll talk again soon then.
I hope so. Maybe one day even face to face.
Yes, we can hope. Bye.
Bye-bye then.